Welcome to another episode of Full Build Friday, where I try to build a character from a comic, game, or similar source using the baseline rules of Pathfinder 2nd Edition and the Path Builder app. I'm wrapping up this month of Halloween horrors with one last frightening figure, the monstrous mecha mummy, Inaros from Warframe. Before we dive straight into it, I should mention that I'm going on vacation starting this weekend, so I'll see you all in about 2 weeks. With that said, let's grow the flesh and forge the steel to determine the build goals for this heroic horror. Inaros is a mummy and sand-themed warframe, who notably has a much higher health than the other warframes, but lacks any of their standard shields. His passive ability only comes up when he enters Bleed Out, at which point he enters a sarcophagus and drains life from enemies until he resurrects himself. His desiccation ability unleashes a wave of cursed sand that blinds and damages enemies while also healing him. He can become a sandstorm that pulls enemies in, draining their health for our mummy mangler. Alternatively, he can drain his own health to activate Scarab Shell, granting him armor that reduces incoming damage and absorbs status effects. Finally, his ultimate ability is Scarab Swarm, which summons the eponymous swarm to damage and corrode his enemies. When this effect kills an enemy, it summons a Swarm Kavat that will lead the swarm to new victims. His unique mods include Desiccation's Curse, which summons a Swarm Kavat when he kills a blinded enemy, Elemental Sandstorm that adds elemental damage to his sandstorm, and Negation Armor, which consumes his Scarab Shell to prevent him from dying. To wrap it all up, Inaros is a mummy-like figure who can control the sands to blind foes or trap them within a sandstorm. He can protect himself with an armor that reduces incoming damage, or by draining the health of enemies before he summons swarms of scarabs and feline-like Kavats to finish them off. This is perhaps the most obvious of the inspirations I've used for this month's host of heroic horrors, with Inaros representing the classic crypt-crawling mummy. With how apparent it is, there's not much to talk about on this topic, so let's just get to the build. I've put together a couple warframes at this point, and I'm sticking with what I've used in the past, the Flesh Warp Ancestry. Warframes are a fusion of technology and flesh, essentially biomechanical suits of armor with supernatural powers, and Flesh Warp is perfect for this, especially when that is combined with the technological heritage, making it harder to influence. However, feats aren't super important to this character, so grab whatever strikes your fancy. I started with Deep Vision so that Inaros has Dark Vision before I took a look at his ability boost. His first boost must go towards Constitution, which is perfectly fine for this character with his high health, but he'll apply his free boost to Wisdom. His background is a little harder to figure out. The original Inaros was known as a hero of Mars who defended them against any threats, before he was finally laid to rest. I settled on Osirionologist given the fact that Osirian is directly based on ancient Egypt, but this is a very setting-specific background. Obviously, Inaros isn't from Egypt or even Osirian, but he draws heavily upon its themes. This background does give him training in occultism and ancient Osirian lore, while also providing him with the oddity identification skill feat. His first boost enhances his constitution, and he also receives a free boost that he'll apply to his wisdom. These investments in wisdom all feed into his druid class, which comes with another ability boost to his casting score. Given his summoning of beetles and great felines, he'll take animal empathy as his voice of nature, get shield block for free, and then gets to choose his druidic order. Inaros takes some inspiration from sand elementals in his design, which led to me taking the Stone Order. This makes him trained in crafting, and grants him the Studying Stone class feat, giving him a bonus to balance on rocky ground, and on his DCs to avoid being forcibly moved or knocked prone. It also grants him his Crushing Ground focus spell, which deals some damage and can make an enemy a little bit vulnerable. For his cantrips and rank spells, I put a slight focus on earth spells, though there aren't really any notable cantrips here. Glass Shield maybe, with the resistance it provides, but on the other hand there are some real nice first rank spells. Prime among them is Gritty Wheeze, which unleashes a damaging cone of sand that dazzles enemies, resembling both the damage and blinding effect of his desiccation. There's also Scouring Sand, which actually has the chance of blinding the creature, but lacks the damage component of it. Obviously, there's also Summon Animal, to summon Inaros' swarms or his Kavat, though he will need to heighten this a bit more before he can fully resemble either of those creatures with his summons. Skills and ability scores are a tiny bit of a mess because druids get so few skills. In addition to that training and crafting, Inaros is automatically trained in nature, and then only becomes trained in Arcana, Athletics, and Religion. He rounds out his ability boosts with an increase to Strength, Constitution, Intelligence, and Wisdom, and he will be focusing on his Wisdom ability score, given that that is his primary casting stat. Constitution will also be important, since Inaros lacks shields, unlike most Warframes, and is pure health. We're pretty early on in this build, but we already have some nice references to Inaros' kit, with stuff like Gritty Wheeze and Summon Animal. However, it's going to be a bit before we can get a good swarm to summon to represent his scarabs. The earliest is maybe the Spider Swarm, available when Inaros can get second rank spells. So, to better cover his swarm early on, he'll take up a Swarm Keeper dedication with his second level class feat. This effectively gives Inaros a swarm as an animal companion, but one that he has to sustain to keep active. Sustaining the swarm does let him move it, but he'll have to use another action to actually give it the chance to deal some damage. This leads to some very funky action economy that I'm not entirely sold on, but it does suit the concept for this crusty canopic character. As for his skill feat, he'll take additional lore for desert lore, given his association with the sand and the desert, making him well versed when it comes to identifying both the threats and wonders of this land. With the difficulty that there is in putting Inaros down, he's going to use Die Hard as his general feat at 3rd level, making it a little bit more difficult to permanently slay him. His big second rank spells are Oaken Resilience to give him the resistance of his Scarab Shell, and Vomit Swarm as another way to produce his Scarab Swarm. Alternatively, if you want your scarabs infesting the fragile flesh of your foes, there's also Worm's Repast as another solid option. As a druid, he'll become an expert in perception and fortitude saves, and his skill increase goes to athletics, making him an expert in that as well. I want to expand on the Swarmkeeper archetype quickly, so 4th level sees Inaros take Pyre and Sting to inflict persistent poison damage with his swarm. This is in reference to the corrosion damage that his Scarab Swarm deals, which is made up, at least partially, of poison. His skill feat is Quick Jump, because Warframes are renowned for their maneuverability. The game's slogan was, at least at some point, "Ninjas play free," and Warframes are meant to exemplify that concept. With the role that Inaros had as a protector and guardian, I like transposable compliance as his ancestry feat at 5th level, which will grant him trained in medicine and allow him to hurt himself to heal others. Access to 3rd rank spells grants him Sand Form, another resistance granting effect that is a bit more on theme than Oaken Resilience. Another good one here is Antlion Trap, which fits his theme and drags people towards its center, akin to his Whirlwind. On the topic of spells, 3rd rank Summon Animal gives him access to his first Big Cat, the Leopard, as a level 2 creature. Through his glass features, he becomes an expert in reflex saves and the nature skill before he assigns 5 ability boost, increasing his strength, dexterity, constitution, and wisdom. He continues to explore his archetype with Mobile Swarm at 6th level, increasing the speed of his swarm, but not by much. And this is mostly to wrap up this archetype so that he can move on to another, but sometimes that 5 extra feet is all you need. We're then going to look at Powerful Leaper as his skill feat for the same reason that we took Quick Jump last time. There is a lot of mobility in Warframe, and this just expands on that. 7th level comes with Fast Recovery, letting Inaros recover more swiftly from poisons and diseases, as well as heal outside of combat. He starts tapping into 4th rank spells here, and the biggest one in my opinion is Mountain Resilience, which offers blanket physical resistance playing into his Scarab Shell. He becomes an expert in his spell DCs and attacks before a skill increase makes him a master in athletics. matching additional lore, also making him a master of desert lore. Alright, we got some big things at level 8 here. First things first is the Mummy Dedication, which comes with a whole host of effects, including a bonus against diseases and poisons, immunity to death effects, and negative healing. He receives a weakness to fire, but gains toughness as a bonus feat, building up to that huge health bar that he's known for. His fist also increases in damage, while losing the non-lethal trait. As a freshly formed undead, he can now make particular use of Call the Blood, a spell to represent the healing effect of several of his abilities. He then goes for a Warframe Classic with Wall Jump as a skill feat, allowing him to bound between walls like the techno-organic space ninja mummy that he is. This is a pretty standard ability with Warframes, and in this regard, Inaros is no different. Despite all that, Inaros is still somewhat lacking in skills, which is the main reason behind taking Startling Appearance, which nets him both training in Intimidation and the Intimidating Glare skill feat. He also receives a skill increase that will make him an expert in Religion, setting up for something else down the line.
Nice tool that can help us later.
By this point, Inaros can use a heightened summon animal to call forth Boar Worm Swarms, which feel like a great fit for a swarm to really get under your enemy's skin, and have the added benefit of dealing acid damage with their swarm attack, matching the corrosion of his Scarab Swarm. Once again, I kinda need to get through this mummy archetype for something else that I have planned, so at 10th level we will take Grave Mummification. This increases a lot of the benefits that Inaros got, making him more resistant to the damage dealt by his desert home, while also increasing his disease and poison resistance, and now giving him a bonus against paralysis and sleep effects. He also gets a skill feat that he spends on natural medicine, letting him use his environs to tend to his team. All of Inaros' healing is self-healing, but this is inspired by his role as a caretaker and guardian upon Mars, and I do want to play into that a little bit more with other skill feats. This time around though, his ability boosts go to Strength, Constitution, Intelligence, and Wisdom. That boost to Intelligence will make him trained in Survival, which will be important coming up very shortly. If Inaros is able to take the Mummy Dedication, that means that he also qualifies for Numb to Death, which lets him come back far more ready to fight after being brought back from the brink, based at least partially on his passive. His class will then make him an expert with his weapons before he masters his will saves, getting the classic feature of receiving a critical success upon rolling a success. He will then take this level skill increase to Religion to master it. This build further explores the sandy subjects surrounding our Sylvan Sorcerer at 12th level, starting with Storm Shroud. This allows Inaros to surround himself with a sandstorm based on his ability of the same name, though this is a defensive effect rather than the offensive one that Sandstorm normally provides. He will also take terrain expertise for the desert, giving him a small bonus on any survival checks that he may attempt in his scorching homeland. Lucky level 13 brings with it Spew Tentacles. There's other warframes that this fits better, my beloved Nidus. But if it's too off for you, take your pick of Flesh Warp Ancestry feats. They aren't actually super important to this particular build. Something that is a little bit more important though, is 7th rank's Control Sand spell, a 2-action cast that can then be sustained for several different effects. The two things of note here is that it is a 5-foot emanation, and one of the effects it can create is just what we've been looking for, a sandstorm that perfectly matches his ability. I also want to mention here that I think sustained spells work best with his swarm. It takes a single action to sustain a spell and generate its effects, which leaves him with 2 actions to move the swarm and then attack with them. It isn't perfect, and there might be turns where he has to choose between sustaining the swarm or his spell, but that is part of the game. You have to make your choices. Now, more on the side of bookkeeping, we've got his Armor Expertise class feature here, his Weapon Specialization giving a bit more punch if he ever makes weapon strikes, and an increase in nature to become a master of it, just as a druid should be. With 2 archetypes under a belt, you probably think it's about time to start picking up some druid feats, right? It makes sense. Well, I'm afraid you are a bit off the mark. because 14th level sees Inaros take a cleric dedication, favoring this option since its spells will scale off of his wisdom, just like his primal spells. I'd probably check out some of the Osirian deities if you're thinking of playing in Galarian, but I had him become trained in stealth and thievery to fit that whole cyber ninja concept. I don't think any of the cantrips particularly suit him, so grab whatever interests you there. Following this, he uses Sacred Defense as a skill feat. I know that Inaros doesn't have shields, but I just want to increase his survivability however I can, because that is an aspect of Inaros. Between his scarab shell and the high health that he can get up to, he's a pretty beefy boy to battle. Taking Fleet for 15th level has a number of benefits, ranging from the obvious speed increase to letting Inaros jump and leap farther than he normally would be able to. He also becomes a Master Spellcaster, a legend in nature and desert lore, and receives 4 ability boosts to his Strength, Constitution, Wisdom, and Charisma, getting a little more use out of his Intimidation and increasing the DC of his Spew Tentacles effect. At 16th level, we're obviously going to follow on from that Cleric archetype with basic Cleric Spellcasting, immediately gaining a slew of divine spells, the most important of which will be Harm, so that Inaros can heal himself, and then Vampiric Feast, so that Inaros can hurt others while increasing his own health. His skill feat is Sanctify Water, which might seem a little strange, but I feel like it fits for a character as tied to the desert as Inaros is. Water is a precious and important thing in such an environment, and I think this demonstrates that a little bit. The rocky environments of Mars, at least those seen in Warframe, lead me to liking Gripping Limbs as his final ancestry feat at 17th level. These grant him a climb speed that he can potentially use to follow his Stinging Swarm with their own climb speed. There's one spell I want to bring up here, and that is Wrathful Storm. This is another sustained spell that can switch up its damage types between cold, electricity, or bludgeoning, which is, at the very least, a tiny nod to his Elemental Sandstorm mod. He also increases his athletic skills to become a legend in that. We're going to keep on with the Cleric class feats for the Expert Cleric Spellcasting at 18th level, which has some more vampiric spells, like Vampiric Maiden and Vampiric Exsanguination, but also has Seal Fate. I talked about this in the last build, and you might be wondering why I'm bringing it up again. Well, the corrosion damage of Scarab Swarm has the added effect of stripping armor and Warframe, increasing the damage that a target takes. For some reason, there isn't a spell that strips resistances, but Seal Fate can be made to fit that idea. At the very least, planting a weakness can reduce the effectiveness of a resistance. There's also the Morphic Manipulation skill feat at this level, which will let Inaros bring greenery to the desert, creating an oasis for himself and his people, though unfortunately a temporary one. I still like the concept of this, and I think it fits with the whole roles Inaros had as a savior on Mars. Given the slight focus that Inaros has had on health, he can probably make some good use out of Robust Health as his 19th level general feat. I certainly wouldn't be opposed to Paizo adding some more pure general feats to the game, but I do appreciate the addition of this one, and the tankiness it offers. His skill increase makes him a legend in religion, which matches his proficiency increase to his spells from Legendary Spellcaster. He also becomes a Primal Hierophant, tapping into 10th rank spells before we move into our final level. In a potentially controversial cut, Inaros is going to spend his final class feat on Master Cleric Spellcasting. He's already maxed out his proficiency with his spells, so he doesn't need it for that, but this will grant him higher ranked spells, such as Devour Life. Unlike any of the vampiric spells, this doesn't grant Inaros temporary hit points. It straight up heals him, and I think that's too nice to pass up on. We then obviously have to leap into Cloud Jump, taking advantage of his athletics proficiency and rounding out his skill feat selection. This really nails some of the insane jumps that Warframe characters can get up to, and is one of the skill feats that I'm more adamant about taking for this build. We finish off the basics of it here with 4 ability boosts to his Dexterity, Intelligence, Wisdom, and Charisma, which grants one final skill increase to make him trained in Society. Obviously, a free archetype game for Inaros is huge, because unless you missed it, this build did not pick up a single Druid class feat. the sole druid feat it does have comes from his order. It's really just an ancillary effect. So if you get to actually take some druid feats, which could only happen in a free archetype game, I'd probably grab the likes of Call the Wild, Hardened Flesh, and Primal Summons. From Swarm Keeper, the best choices are probably Carried with a Swarm, Expanded Swarm, and then Buzzing Death Cicadas, almost solely to have something that targets will saves. Mummy could let us take something like Terrain Form, or Desiccating Inhalation, since the latter drains the health of his victims. As for Cleric, we got most of what we want out of there, and the only thing I could really see him using is maybe Divine Breath for some more spells. That about wraps up our Royal Revenant, so let's take a look at this pretty little package we've put together. Inaros is a technological flesh warp druid of the Stone Order and an Osirionologist background, which is mainly because Osirian is pretty much just Egypt, and that features heavily in the themes and design of Inaros. His high health comes from the toughness granted by his mummy archetype, fitting one of those themes, as well as the constitution he invested in. Sadly, I couldn't quite capture his bleed out effect, but he does pick up a number of life-draining spells such as Call the Blood, the handful of vampiric spells, and Devour Life. Numb to Death can also be thought to play into this at least a little bit. Gritty Wheeze or Scouring Sands work solidly for the blinding effect of his Desiccation, with the former actually inflicting some damage. For Sandstorm, we have to build up to Control Sand, for one of its several sustain effects, but earlier than that, we can at least lean into flavor with the Mummy's Storm Shroud. There's also something like Antlion Trap, which features the drawing in enemies effect. To cover Scarab Shell, at different levels, we look at Oaken Resilience, Sand Form, and finally Mountain Resilience, to recreate that enhanced armor that reduces damage. His Scarab Swarm ultimate can end up summoning two different types of creatures. Obviously, it calls forth the eponymous Swarm, which we see with both the Heightened Summon Animal spells and his Swarm Keeper archetype, but it can also call forth a Swarm Kavat, which is most easily created with Summon Animal. This already sort of ends up capturing his Desiccation's Cursed mod, and he can sneak in a variety of damage types with Wrathful Storm as his Elemental Storm. However, he doesn't quite nail the Negation Armor, the last of his unique mods. Bound and bandages this bulky being bedevils baddies with bevies of beetles, blinding blasts, and billowing blows that bear them to the bone, but still bears a boundless benevolence. We have come to the end of our Halloween party, and what a strange little gang it is. A real host of horrific heroes. I'm not actually sure they'd be a good group, but I'd at least be interested in seeing what shenanigans they get up to for a session or two. As always, let me know what you think of this build, and what other sorts of builds you'd like to see in a comment. You can of course check out this build over on the blog, which is linked below alongside the Monster Monday Twitter and Discord. Thanks for watching. Be sure to have a frightful Friday, a happy Halloween, and I'll see you all again in November.